Considered the rank outsider just weeks ago, Francois Fillon wins the Republican presidential nomination in France. The Syrian Army takes decisive steps against terrorists in eastern Aleppo, liberating neighbourhood after neighbourhood. As a result, hundreds of civilians are able to flee from the horrors of extremist rule. An American news publication issues a report on how to determine if your president is a dictator. With an image of Donald Trump front and center, we applied the arguments to some other leaders, though, and the results may surprise you. Also ahead this RT News Hour, the controversial and often tough-talking president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, speaks exclusively to RT. We ask him how he feels about the current state of U.S.-Philippines relations. Around the clock across the world, this is RT International. My name's Ewan O'Neill. Good to have your company. Our top story this hour, the Syrian Army has just liberated a key district in eastern Aleppo from militants. That is according to the Russian Defense Ministry. It comes following successful advances by Syrian government forces into other rebel-held parts of the city, which have allowed hundreds of civilians to flee. Lizzie Phelan reports from the country now.
Huge developments over the weekend. Pro-government forces, along with Kurdish forces, have managed to retake around 8 neighbourhoods in the rebel-held east of Aleppo. We're seeing reports of thousands of civilians that have managed to escape those besieged rebel-held neighbourhoods. It looks as though the government forces retaking these areas has enabled those civilians who wanted to leave to do so, and now that they have that option, we're seeing thousands that have chosen to do so. I think we have some video now of civilians describing the ordeal that they have been living in East Aleppo.
They're shooting at us all the time while we're walking to this side.
We were left without any food or water. They deprived us of everything.
Now, earlier we'd seen reports of rebel forces attacking civilian protests, against them being forbidden from leaving by opposition forces who controlled their neighbourhoods. We also have some video of civilians describing the difficulty they had in trying to get out from that besieged area.
We wanted to leave, but they tried to stop us from doing so. They threatened to kill us, but we tried again and again. Finally, we escaped.
Every time we tried to flee, they caught us and turned us back.
The militants are lying. They were holding us there. Even now, they're holding families there. They don't let people go.
We're hearing reports from local sources of militants considering surrendering. So obviously a lot of speculation now that after 4 years of being divided between pro and anti-government forces, being the scene of some of the most violent episodes of the Syrian war, that Aleppo may be finally close to coming back under the full control of pro-government forces. And this is really the last chunk of significant urban territory that the rebels control. If they lose it, this will be a decisive turning point in the Syrian conflict.
Now, in a year of political upsets, the French primaries are now also sending out shockwaves. The Republican Party has chosen its candidate for next year's presidential election, with victory claimed by yet another outsider, Francois Fillon.
I am victorious again. It's a great victory based on my beliefs. France cannot put up with divisions. France wants the truth and decisive actions. The previous 5-year period was pathetic. We will make a new start, the like of which hasn't been seen in 30 years.
Well, RT's Polly Boyko has been gauging the reaction in Paris to Fillon's win.
We're watching French people wake up and go to work to headlines about Fillon's stunning victory last night. And you can take a look at some of the headlines here. This one says, "Everybody going right," talking about the dissatisfaction that French people feel with the current government. Leader Maximo here. People very surprised. This headline here talking about the groundswell of support for Francois Fillon. And what's interesting is you've got some headlines that are discussing just how interesting this man's unexpected rise to the top of the Republican Party really was, because just 2 weeks ago people were calling him Mr. Nobody. You've got an article in here saying that he managed to get 4 million people to come and vote in these Republican primaries 2 Sundays in a row, which is far more than back in 2011 when the current ruling Socialist Party had their primaries to pick their leader. So this is a man that's come from nowhere, seemingly, as the underdog, to be finally chosen as the official Republican candidate for presidency. And of course, he's really piqued the interest of the French people. All this despite the fact that the media have sometimes laid into him pretty harshly for his campaign. He was criticised for liking Margaret Thatcher, on his anti-immigrant stance. He's quite tough on that. For his plans to shrink the French state and cut the number of civil servants drastically. He wants to implement pro-business reforms. And also, above all, he's been criticised for his foreign policy because he wants to be friends with Russia, and that gets you in trouble in the media around here. Take a listen to one of his recent statements.
We need a lot of allies in order to win the war against terrorism. Among those allies is Russia, who we continue to punish undeservingly.
See, a lot of people didn't take well to those kinds of ideas, and people here have been linking him to Putin in various ways, saying that they're chummy, that they get each other presents, that Fillon has stayed at his house in Sochi, but none of it seemed to have put off the French voters here, who ended up electing him as their official candidate. And of course, why? People are trying to understand why people voted for him. Well, I've been speaking to French people on the streets here. Take a listen to what they had to say.
Very complicated, and I don't know in May for who I would vote. I think it's all over the world that we are in a very big change, and so I think it's also why we need also to compromise sometimes, but not always.
I'm pretty sure he'll win the presidential elections because people want renewal and a change in politics. The majority of French people have a centre-right take on politics. We all want alternation and change. Francois Fillon is the one able to offer that.
There's such an air of dissatisfaction with the current government here in France. The Socialist Party is currently in disarray and cahoots. They're trying to decide who their presidential candidate will be, and there seems to be a crisis going on within the current ruling party. So you've got a groundswell of support for this new candidate, and no one really can tell how these presidential elections are going to play out.
So what's next? Well, after securing his position as the Republican Party's presidential candidate, Francois Fillon is likely to face off against far-right leader Marine Le Pen in May's election. Well, we spoke to Thierry Mariani, a French MP. He offered his thoughts on why the vote went Fillon's way.
Francois Fillon, why is this victory such a surprise? Because he's spoken out for the silent French people, the right-wing views who are not usually heard. Francois Fillon rose to prominence step by step because he worked incredibly hard on his programme. Today he is the one who said no to the European concept. All others support the EU as if it were a religion. He is also a man who represents France as a traditional Catholic country, which is proud of its history. Taking all this into account, I think the French need some calm, and with solid convictions for representing the right wing. In my opinion, Francois Fillon is a good candidate.
The Fillon victory for me was predicted because he worked a lot. He spoke to French people truly, telling that we need some reforms, and people have reacted and thought that in times of tempest you need a strong harbor, and the strong harbor is a nation. Not a nation which is short, a small nation, but a nation open to other nations. That's the new way, I think, to make politics, to have a true Europe that will be a power in itself, but talking equally with America and China. It is necessary to reinforce the links between the two countries, France and Russia, and to work together against Islamism, terrorism in Syria.
Well, the apparently pro-Russian Fillon isn't the only figure who could be on the verge of upsetting the political status quo in Europe. In a recent interview, the president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, was asked whether EU sanctions against Moscow would be maintained with Donald Trump as leader. This is the response given.
We are not dependent on US foreign policy. The US will do what it wants to do, and Europeans will have their own interests within their own scope to manage.
Yeah, very direct talk, but that contradicts comments made by US Vice President Joe Biden when the decision to impose sanctions on Russia was first taken.
We've given Putin a simple choice: respect Ukraine's sovereignty or face increasing consequences. That has allowed us to rally the world's major developed countries to impose real cost on Russia. It is true they did not want to do that. But again, it was America's leadership and the President of the United States insisting, oftentimes almost having to embarrass Europe to stand up.
The United States policy has influenced very heavily the foreign policy of the European Union, particularly as regards Russia. And it doesn't take a genius to see that in the sanctions. At the same time, there's a dynamic between the European institutions and the European member states. This is thought of these days in terms of the post-Brexit and post-Trump effect of populism and Euroscepticism. But that is only one possible factor guiding the evolution of European foreign policy. A further issue is the dynamics within the European member states who want to be active and constructive players of the European house. And there you have potential for very dramatic developments within France, which together with Germany is the long-standing and original locomotive